Welcome to our lab on the independent samples t-test. In this lab, we're going to focus on three main things. We want to talk a little bit about the independent variable and the dependent variable and its role and their role that they play in the context of an independent samples t-test. This is important, foundational for us to understand when we would choose an independent samples t-test based on the research question that we want to answer. Then we're going to conduct an independent samples t-test by hand and then check our answers using Jamovi. And then finally, we have another example that we're going to be conducting an independent samples t-test using Jamovi. So by the end of this lab, we should be able to recognize when an independent samples t-test is appropriate, and then also be able to explain our results in more standardized language using APA style. Okay, let's start with our first lab problem. This is really rooted in consumer psychology, and consumer psychology is looking at lots of different thoughts, feelings, and behaviors related to buying things or money, things like that. But this example is focusing on happiness and purchases. So the general idea behind this example is that people may get more happiness from life experiences than from material items, which makes sense. I mean, when we spend money to go on vacation or go to a basketball game, those are life experiences. We don't come away with anything other than our memories, which we hope are great. In contrast, material items are things that are tangible, physical, that we can touch. Things like if we were buying a pair of shoes or a car, things that we can actually touch. So that's what we're looking at. So in this study example, we have some participants who are randomly assigned to reflect on either a material purchase or an experiential purchase. And the idea here is that participants are writing about their experience, their life experience or material item, and then directly after that, they're reporting about their happiness using the subjective happiness scale. And the thought behind this is that the researcher thinks that by writing about what we've purchased, it makes it more sort of activated in our mind and activates those feelings that we had when we made that purchase. So by, measuring happiness directly after that, we're going to sort of capture what are the feelings of happiness, what level of happiness did we have around that purchase. So our research question here, is there a difference between reported happiness between individuals who reflect on an experiential purchase, which is life experience, versus material purchases? Now let's talk about the independent variable and the dependent variable. So you may already be familiar with these variables. It's worth reviewing because they play an important role for us to determine whether or not the independent samples t-test is appropriate. So when we're talking about the independent variable, just in general, the independent variable is part of the research design. It helps us understand what is going to influence or change what we measure. So the independent variable is what we start out with as part of our research design. We're looking at its influence on what we measure, which is the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is what we measure, the outcome of interest. So when we're looking at an independent samples t-test, in this context, we're looking at two different groups, and typically that's what the independent samples t-test is used, is looking at two different groups or conditions. This is considered a nominal scale variable. This is important for the independent samples t-test. It has to be nominal. And the independent variable in our case is purchase groups, either writing about experiences or writing about material items. And so it's one independent variable, and there's two levels of the independent variable, which is important. That's what we need. We need two groups or two conditions in order to be able to use the independent samples t-test. And we're looking at its influence on the dependent variable, and this is what we measure. This can be either interval or ratio scaled. In this case, we're looking at the outcome of happiness. How happy are they? We're comparing happiness between experiential purchases and material purchases groups. And so that is our outcome of interest is happiness. That is the dependent variable. So that's a little bit about the independent variable and the dependent variable and the role that they play. So our independent variable has to be nominal and 2 levels for an independent samples t-test, and the dependent variable has to be numerical. It has to be interval or ratio scaled in order for us to meet the criteria to be able to run an independent samples t-test. So now you're going to be answering some questions in the lab related to some of the content that we've discussed in this video.